Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud, what startups actually pay? So, Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud cost comparison for startups. It's something a lot of people ask about, and today we're going to walk through it step by step. Let's talk about moving on to compute costs side by side. The clearest way to start any Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud comparison is to price an identical workload. Take a common startup setup, 2 general-purpose virtual machines, running continuously for a month in a US East region. On compute alone, Google Cloud runs about 10 to 20% cheaper than Azure and AWS for general-purpose workloads. AWS and Azure are close enough that other factors usually outweigh the raw compute difference. Now, storage and bandwidth, where the bills actually add up. Compute is predictable. Bandwidth and storage are where startups get surprised. Storage pricing. Azure is cheapest for pure storage at scale. For a startup storing 5 terabytes of data, that's $90 per month on Azure versus $115 per month on AWS. Not a huge difference early on, but it compounds fast as you grow. Next up, moving on to free tiers and startup credits, what Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud actually offer. All 3 providers offer introductory credits, but the structures differ enough to matter. New account credits. Google Cloud's always free tier is genuinely useful for early stage teams. You get 1 free F1 micro VM per month indefinitely, 5 GB of cloud storage, and enough cloud functions calls to run lightweight automation without touching a credit card. AWS and Azure have always free tiers too, but with tighter limits. Now, moving on to hidden costs that dawn and #39. appear on pricing pages. The Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud cost comparison for startups always looks cleaner in spreadsheets than in actual billing dashboards. Here are the costs that catch teams off guard. Support plan pricing. All 3 providers charge separately for meaningful technical support. Now, let's talk about Azure pricing for small businesses, the Microsoft ecosystem advantage. If your startup or SMB already uses Microsoft products, Azure pricing for small businesses gets more interesting than the raw compute numbers suggest. Azure integrates natively with Active Directory, Microsoft 365, Teams, and Dynamics 365. Identity management that would require separate tooling on AWS, such as Okta licenses and custom SSO setup, often comes included or requires minimal configuration on Azure. Where Azure wins for SMBs. Let's talk about when AWS makes more financial sense. AWS is the market leader, and that has real implications beyond pricing. Where AWS wins. For a startup where the founding team has deep AWS expertise, staying on AWS avoids a migration learning curve that can cost 2 to 3 months of productivity. That's real money, and it doesn't appear in any pricing calculator. Let's talk about now, Google Cloud and #39. Pricing strengths and where it struggles. Google Cloud is the most aggressive on compute pricing and has some differentiated products worth knowing about. Where Google Cloud wins on cost. Where Google Cloud struggles. Let's talk about a real scenario, Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud cost comparison for startups. Let's put numbers on a concrete example, a B2B SaaS startup with 200 active users, a web application, an API server, a managed PostgreSQL database, and 1 terabyte of storage. Monthly estimate. That last row surprises most teams. Google Cloud's enhanced support tier at $500 per month tips the total well past Azure and AWS for a startup at this scale. Drop to Google's standard tier and the total falls to $273, but that tier provides slower response times and no production-level coverage. Now, cloud cost optimization, what works regardless of provider? The Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud cost comparison for startups matters less than most teams think if you're not doing the basics of cloud cost control. The most common waste patterns we see. According to the Flexera State of the Cloud report, organizations waste an average of 28% of cloud spend. For a startup at $5,000 per month, that's $1,400 sitting unused every month. Let's talk about moving on to how to choose a decision framework for startups. Given the numbers above, here's a practical way to make the call. Choose Azure if. Choose AWS if. Now, conclusion. The Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud cost comparison for startups doesn't produce a universal winner. Google Cloud runs slightly cheaper on compute and offers automatic sustained use discounts. Azure wins on flat-rate support pricing, storage costs, and Microsoft ecosystem integration. AWS offers the deepest service catalog and the largest developer talent pool, but its percentage-based support pricing adds up at scale. For most startups and SMBs, start with the startup credit programs and your team's existing skills. Then factor in your industry's compliance requirements and your actual workload profile before committing to a platform. If you're evaluating Azure or planning a cloud migration, we help startups and SMBs design cost-efficient cloud architectures and implement the optimization steps that actually move the needle. Get in touch to talk through your specific setup.